Why, hello there, and welcome back to Eurospy Cinema, a series where I review various movies that fit into the Eurospy category. Today I'll be reviewing a film that features a protagonist with an alliterative name, a side character who has a more interesting story than the lead, and three main villains, all of whom are sorely lacking in the menace department. This masterpiece is Espionage in Tangier, a Spanish-Italian production from 1965 where plot is by far not the main focus. If this sounds familiar, such an idea is similar to the approach found in The Wacky World of James Todd, which I reviewed a little while ago. However, in this film, the focus is on action, and lots of it. It stars Luis Davila as Agent S077, the alliterative Mike Murphy, and Jose Gresci as Lee Randall, the beautiful female agent who Mike Murphy spends most of his time with. Anyway, without further ado, here is a very short summary of what happens in this film. The movie opens on some scientists conducting experiments on a small metal plate. Through the words of this man here, who is basically walking talking exposition, we discover that this group of scientists have spent a long time working on creating a special plate that is the final component of an invisibility ray. After a short demonstration by the head scientist, it is stolen when we realize that his two assistants were actually double agents. Following this, the audience is lurched into the title sequence. Most of the time, I'm quite a fan of these sort of inverted negative colours and stills for the titles of movies and stuff, and it can make things look pretty interesting. Unfortunately, I find the stills used in this movie's titles are more disturbing than intriguing or interesting. After the titles and a few kisses, Mike Murphy reports to headquarters where his chief informs him of the events that happened in the pre-title sequence. He is entrusted with the simple task of finding the plate and is sent to Tangiers where a guy called Robo will fill him in further. On the most convincing airplane set that I have ever seen, Mike meets two female enemy agents who he's worked against before, Lee and Arlette. Following his arrival in Tangiers, Mike heads to his hotel, where it happens that Lee and Arlette are also staying. Mike goes to his room and discovers that he is too late, his contact is already dead. So Mike beats up the guy who killed him and then gets a phone call that was meant for his contact. He discovers from this that a guy called Jules Martin has the proof that Mike Murphy's contact wanted, and will meet him this afternoon. But meanwhile, the operator was listening in on the call and passes this info on to some unknown party. Mike then meets up with his old friend Inspector Ravel, who is glad to see him. He tells the inspector a little about his mission, gets a bit of information in return, and heads off to visit Jules Martin. He meets up with Mr. Martin, who gets killed and just manages to tell Mike something about the second officer of a boat called the Stardust. That night, through some very strange camera work that leaves me thoroughly puzzled as to the geography of this location, Mike visits the boat called the Stardust. But he's just a little too late, as the bad guys kill the second officer before Mike reaches him. Another fight and chase ensue, including a somewhat secret door that leads to a coffin manufacturing establishment. After yet another fight, we get a glimpse of, I guess, who I'll call the main villain of the film. We realize here that Arlette and Lee must be villains as well, as they're working for this guy in the white suit, whose name is Rigo Ori. After Arlette and this other henchman leave, Mike meets Ori for the first time and spouts a little exposition for the audience so they have an idea of who this guy is. After a little more chit-chat and a few sneaky traps, Mike uses a lighter on Ori's feet as a means to interrogate him and discover what his plans are. Just as Mike is leaving, another of Ori's goons shows up and tries to kill him. Mike dispatches of him swiftly and with a grin, which makes me question how mentally stable this man is. Another fairly good car chase later, and Mike gets a car and heads to the Club Capri. After a seemingly rather unnecessary fight, Mike meets up with Magda, another female spy who he is well acquainted with. Meanwhile, outside, one of Ori's goons is watching the club and having a little chat with Ori over a rather nice radio he has installed in his car. I find Ori's camera view of the car hilarious. For him to have that angle, there has to be some kind of invisible camera installed out the top of the car about here. Mike asks Magda about Ori and she tells him about a big villa he owns and that if he's looking for Ori, he should go there. Mike then rocks up at the villa and proceeds to explore the basement. He gets trapped in the basement with the classic trope of it steadily increasing with water. Lee and Arlette are watching the proceedings on TV, but thankfully for Mike, Lee loves him enough for him to be spared. Also, I love how some of the shots in this section have Mike completely dry after being thoroughly submerged, and then in others he's dripping wet. After this, Mike visits Lee and they spend an evening together. The next morning, Mike takes a bath and puts on his empty money belt. Yeah, I know how you feel, Mike, being poor can be hard. Arlette then shows up at the villa again, and the henchman who drove her there leaves for some other location. This causes Mike to run outside and chase him. And Mike is in turn chased by these other random guys. After some classic car chasey things where these guys say this classic line,
"Force Murphy off the road, but be careful not to hurt him."
They drive after Ori's henchman and shoot his tires. They then beat him up, put him in their car and drive off. I have to say I'm slightly confused as to why they do this when their orders were only to follow Mike, but anyway. After waking up again, Mike uses his super spy skills to somehow guess exactly where the baddies took Ori's henchmen, so he drives there. Instead of trying to be stealthy and break into the house, Mike opts for the much more logical approach of just driving straight up to the front door. And who would have guessed it? He's caught immediately. Mike is taken inside and we discover that this place is actually owned by Magda, and thus she is sort of the secondary main villain. Ori's henchman is then tortured in a mildly disturbing way and passes out, or dies, I'm not 100% sure. After having found out where Ori is, Magda then leaves to see him. Mike takes this opportunity to escape and follows Magda and her goons. A couple more fights later, we see Ori, Magda, Lee, and a bunch of goons all in what appears to be Ori's house? Not much of a lair, but whatever. We learn here that Ori's goon, who was tortured earlier, purposely fed Magda false information so that she would come to this place for Ori to catch her. He then tells Magda that he's going to kill her, but she isn't fazed by this, claiming that Mike will save her. Considering that she's had Mike beaten up 3 times already, I don't know why she would think he would help her, but anyway. Following this, Mike shows up and is captured. We then realise that the professor from the beginning of the film is also in Ori's house, much to Mike's surprise. Remember that money belt of Mike's from earlier that he had very little money in? Turns out that the invisibility plate had been hidden in it by Lee for safekeeping, and now she takes it back. I guess I'm probably being a little pedantic here, but this plot point seems to make very little sense. There's no logical reason for the baddies to hide the plate on Mike. It isn't as if he was going to be smuggling it in somewhere for them. All he does is drive to Magda's and then get caught again. Anyway, Lee then gives the plate to the professor. The professor then has a short speech about how the invisibility plate could destroy the whole universe and turns a fire invisible. Ori then tells the professor to hand the plate over to these other random guys who'll pay plenty of money for it. The professor then goes psycho and runs off with the invisibility ray and Lee. Mike then races off in hot pursuit while everyone else just kinda stands around. The professor runs to a nearby boat and drives off. Thankfully, Mike grabs its mooring rope and hangs on behind it. Mike climbs on the boat and is suddenly dry, and because the professor pulled the plate out of the gun, he decides to tackle Mike with a spanner. After another speech about how he'll rule the entire world and bring about peace for all, the professor falls overboard. I guess he drowns. I mean, Mike doesn't even try to swim after the professor, he just kinda looks around and then gets to the boat's controls. And after this great exchange,
Are you hurt?
No.
Mike and Lee, in true Eurospy style, boat off into the end credits. And that was Espionage in Tangier, a classic Eurospy adventure. It's another example of a switch off your brain movie. If you're tired or have had a few drinks, then it's perfect. Because I found the plot was very thin, I assumed that much had been cut out of the film before the dub into English, but after some research I discovered that I do have the full copy of the film, all 1 hour and 36 minutes of it, but that there are actually other versions of the film out there that are only 1 hour. How muddled those editions must be, I can only imagine. The invisibility plate works as a pretty nice MacGuffin in the film, but it can be pretty easy to forget that that is what Mike is pursuing. It's basically just a reason to string all these action sequences together, and considering that's its purpose, it works pretty well. The action is pretty well shot and choreographed. I mean, there aren't any specifically unique fights, but there is one on a rope ladder that is pretty neat, and the fight in the coffin warehouse is also fairly good. The torture sequence was surprisingly better than I thought it would be, and is so good it kinda jars with the rest of the film's tone. Despite how the actor is dubbed, you can really feel his pain, and it overall does a really nice job of setting up Magda to be a villain in a very short space of time. The acting in the film is overall pretty good. Luis de Villa does a nice job as Mike Murphy. He's acting well, but the terrible one-liners and dubbing really let him down. Poor Mike, he seems to think that witticisms consist of things like,
I'm studying the folklore of Tangiers.
I mean, Mike does have a few really weird moments. For instance, he slaps Lee a number of times throughout the film, and it just kinda makes him come off as a bit of a git. In addition to this, I was quite disturbed when, after killing one of Ori's henchmen, Mike puts on a big grin and walks off. I mean, it really made me question his mental stability. Jose Grachi does a very nice job of playing Lee. Like the other actors in this film, she unfortunately suffers from the poor dubbing, which can sometimes make her lines seem a little out of place. The plot doesn't really actually give her very much to do, except kind of exchange dialogue with Murphy and kiss him, but she does do those things fairly well. Alberto Dalbez is fine as Rigo Ori. He comes across as more of a henchman than as the big bad main villain. I mean, I kept expecting there to be someone else who turns out to be Ori's boss or something. I guess this probably comes from a lack of motivations. The film kinda glosses over exactly why he wants the plate. I assume it's for the money, but considering how many houses and secret lairs he has, you think he'd be fine. I think it probably also relates a little to the lack of physical menace he has. When we first see Ori, he looks like a big bad guy with the sunglasses and such, but as soon as he takes them off, he loses all mystery and interest for me. Paula Cristal, much like Jose, does a fine job of playing Magda. The main problem her character suffers from is her late introduction to the film. She just kind of appears about 50 minutes in and the film treats us as if we should have known her the whole time. The plot twist that she too is a villain is just kinda lackluster, cause it wasn't set up. If we'd been invested more in her relationship with Mike, then the reveal would have been more dramatic rather than what we have now. Professor Griff, or Greff, depending on who says his name, was played by Thomas Blanco. He's fine. As a villain, I find his motivations more believable, and the insane way that he is played is actually pretty good. But his reveal is possibly the most random plot point of the film, and believe me, there are a lot of random plot points in this film. It works to set up the final scene of the film, but it also means that Ori and Magda are completely sidelined and forgotten about for the last segment of the movie. I just wanted to put a quick word in here for Rafael Vaquero's Inspector Radwill. This character is surprisingly well handled. He has a good bit of banter with Mike, and their relationship is really well established through only a tiny bit of dialogue. This line here actually made me think that the Inspector was going to turn out to be a villain.
Take care. There's not much on in Tangiers, Mike. Things have changed down here.
Places change, maybe. Old friends don't.
But sadly, he doesn't even appear again. It's sad that one of the best written characters in the film has only one scene. If the Inspector showed up at the end to be the main villain, it would have been so great. It's pretty sad they wasted this opportunity, but anyway. The camera work in this movie is overall quite competent. It shows what's happening in a straightforward and easy to follow way. There's only one time where it left me scratching my head, and that was when Mike arrived at the boat called the Stardust. I've rewatched this scene multiple times, and still, the geography of this location has me thoroughly confused. The special effects in this film are fine for the time. Anything that turns invisible does so fairly convincingly. The only major letdown is the tracking of the ray onto the pistol. The ray is often very far away from the pistol's barrel, and I can only assume this was something to do with the filmmakers rushing to get the film to cinema screens, but who really knows? The music in this adventure is a little bizarre too. Benedetto Gia wrote a fairly good theme for the film, and this basically just plays on repeat for the majority of scenes. When it does change to something else, however, the transitions can be very jarring, such as here when Mike pushes a guy off a rope ladder. Overall, Espionage in Tangier is a fine Eurospy adventure. As I mentioned before, if you switch off your brain and focus on the action, then that's where the real enjoyment of it lies. Mike Murphy and the rest of the characters are all pretty fine. Nobody really stands out except for the Inspector, but he is in a blink and you miss it kind of role. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode of Eurospy Cinema, so I'll see you later. Goodbye.